Yeah, because of my eyes. We're from the Philippines.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to AP US History. As we look today at how the rise of the Empire of Japan. Because Europe was only one theater of the Second World War, in Asia, another empire was expanding ruthlessly. Because in the early 20th century, Japan was a rapidly growing power. The Meiji Restoration had brought Japan from medieval economy to a modern one in just a few decades. Victories in the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War had established Japan as a major power, and picking up a few of Germany's Pacific colonies after World War I had confirmed that. After World War I as well, Japan became a member of the League of Nations. Japan, in principle, was a constitutional monarchy, with an elected legislature called the Diet, and an emperor by the name of Hirohito. But Japan had also developed, if not quite a totalitarian dictatorship, one heavily influenced by the military. And the emperor was officially the head of the military. He was also the head of the Shinto religion, the traditional religion of Japan, who viewed him at least as a high priest and possibly even a god in his own right. And furthermore, while Japan had modernized economically, and at least on paper had modernized politically, socially they had remained, in many ways, the medieval society they seemed to have left behind. The military was viewed, as it was viewed too in some European countries, as the highest embodiment of national honor. And the old samurai tradition of Bushido, or the way of the warrior, was still honored in the military. This valued bravery, honor, and self-sacrifice. Among other things, surrender was out of the question. A soldier who could not fight anymore was better off committing ritual suicide, as shown there, than to surrender. Better to fight to the death than be captured. And therefore, when they captured enemy soldiers, they treated them with no respect and often with great brutality. Among other things, Japan had not signed the Geneva Accords, creating some of the first rules governing decent treatment of prisoners in warfare. After the First World War, the Empire of Japan included Korea, Taiwan, several small islands in the Western Pacific. They also had a sphere of influence in China, controlling Port Arthur and some other port towns, and the entire region known as Manchuria in northeastern China. Technically part of the Republic of China, but the Japanese were able to occupy it. Among other things, the Japanese military guarded all the railroads in Manchuria, which were under Japanese ownership. And then, September 18th, 1931, at a place called Mukden, part of the South Manchuria Railway was blown up. The Japanese blamed this Mukden incident on Chinese terrorists, although today it is generally assumed the railroad was actually blown up by the Japanese themselves to give them an excuse to invade Manchuria, which they did the next day. By February 27, 1932, the Japanese completely controlled Manchuria in northeastern China, which they renamed Manchukuo because that was easier for the Japanese to pronounce. It was officially left a separate country, ruled by a Chinese emperor, but one who had to do exactly as he was told by the Japanese. A year after this, in 1933, the League of Nations finally criticized Japan's invasion of Manchuria, but did nothing to try to reverse it. In response to this, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations, as Italy and Germany would do a couple years later. And besides this, Japan, and for that matter, many countries, had the right to keep soldiers in many parts of China, including in what was then called the city of Peiping. And this is a little bit confusing, as this city, a very important one in China, has changed names a few times. For one thing, how Chinese characters are transliterated into European alphabets has changed. And the name of the city has changed too. Peiping was the name of what had previously been called Peking. meaning northern capital. But under the Republic of China, the capital had moved from Peiping to Nanking, meaning southern capital, and Peking had been renamed Peiping, or City of Peace. But that as under the way Chinese was transliterated in the early and mid-20th century, today it is instead written as Beijing. So what today is the capital of China, Beijing, was traditionally referred to as Peking, and then for a few years in the 1920s and 30s as Peiping, which can make you a little confusing for people looking back at historical documents. But the city was known in 1937 as Peiping. And one landmark in Peiping was the Marco Polo Bridge, an ancient bridge seen by Marco Polo when he visited China in the early 1200s. Now, on June 7, 1937, some Japanese soldiers legally stationed in Peiping were practicing some night maneuvers on the bridge. All they had not given advance warning, as they were required to do. The Chinese were afraid they were being invaded and fired a few shots. A Japanese soldier went missing, and the Japanese claimed he had been kidnapped. The Japanese demanded the right to search the area. The Chinese said go ahead, but they began moving more and more troops into Peiping. And by the end of July 1937, Japan and China were at war, and Peiping was in Japanese hands. The Japanese invasion of China, sometimes called the Second Sino-Japanese War, was brutal. The Japanese managed to conquer most of northeastern China by 1940, although they found it difficult to control. They also controlled a number of the other major coastal cities. Again, treated the Chinese cruelly. The most famous of these incidents took place in Nanking, today referred to as Nanjing, which was then the capital of China. The Japanese arrived in December of 1937. The Chinese army abandoned it, not feeling prepared to defend it. All they did defend other places elsewhere in China. But with the city undefended, between December of 1937 and February of 1938, the Japanese army engaged in rape, murder, arson, theft, and what is known as the Rape of Nanking. Although rape could traditionally mean in warfare just the complete pillaging of a city, in destruction of lives and property, but of course sexual rape as well, which was a big part of it, as the Japanese army encouraged their soldiers to rape local civilians. It's believed that somewhere between 150,000 and 300,000 men, women, and children were killed in Nanking. The newspaper article you can see there shows the first and second place finishers in the cutting off heads competition, as a number of Japanese soldiers competed to cut the heads off prisoners with their swords. I'm not sure the exact rules for the cutting off heads competition. If there's a time limit or if you just went until you got tired. But to make a game of something for the winner to cut off 106 prisoners' heads says quite a bit about Japan's attitudes towards others. And again, this went on for months and months, at least probably. Japan claims this is vastly exaggerated and essentially never happened. Every now and then a textbook will be published for Japanese high schools saying that. And then there are riots in China and they burn down Toyota factories. China being pretty angry about this, even 80 years later, understandably. And during the attack on Nanking, others suffered too. There was a small American gunboat patrolling the rivers in China, as by treaty we could do. And December of 1937, a Japanese bomber sank USS Panay. 3 Americans were killed, as were a number of Chinese on ships the Panay was trying to escort to safety. Again, fortunately, the Panay sank slowly, so not many lives were lost, but it was still an attack on an American ship. But Americans were so eager to avoid war that we wanted to make sure this did not become something like the sinking of the Maine. And so when the Japanese finally offered to apologize for this accident and pay a small fee, American diplomats eagerly accepted that offer. But in fact, we've since learned this was no accident. The Japanese sank the Panay on purpose to see what we would do. and our eagerness to avoid a fight convinced the Japanese that we were weak. In Nanking and elsewhere, the Japanese kidnapped women and forced them to serve as prostitutes for the army, calling them comfort women. This was especially true of women in the Japanese-controlled territory of Korea, but happened to women elsewhere as well, including white women captured when Japanese began taking over European colonies too. The idea being, this gave the Japanese greater control over whom their soldiers raped, saying it was a kindness to the local civilians so they could stop gang raping them, as had been the practice. In prisoner of war camps, the treatment of prisoners was terrible. Many were deliberately starved to death, or simply starved because of Japan's lack of resources. Many were beaten, many deliberately tortured, some subjected to medical experiments, not much different from those the Nazis did in their concentration camps. One doctor later said the first couple of times he sawed the leg off a living patient, all the screams kind of upset him, but eventually kind of got used to it. In some POW camps, the Japanese practiced cannibalism, sometimes out of desperation, but sometimes simply to terrify their prisoners. Supposedly the liver and the upper thighs are good if you grill them. After the war, some Japanese soldiers who committed cannibalism were meant to go on trial, but it turned out no one had ever outlawed cannibalism as a war crime because it never occurred to anybody you would have to. They finally charged some soldiers with prevention of an honorable burial, that being the closest they could think of. Indeed, Japan has, with a couple small exceptions, never apologized and rarely even acknowledged these atrocities, whereas Germany has apologized and, as far as it could, tried to make up for many of its crimes during the Second World War. Japan did eventually apologize to Korea for the prostitution to comfort women, although a couple years ago said maybe they should take that apology back because it probably didn't happen. Now, in 1938, the Japanese invaded the Soviet Union, but were defeated in 1939. So that in 1941, Japan and the Soviet Union signed a Neutrality Pact, agreeing not to fight one another, a pact that would last until the summer of 1945, so that while the Soviet Union would eventually become one of the allies against Germany, they would not fight against Japan until the last couple weeks of World War II. And Japan, in September of 1940, signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, thus becoming part of the Axis. Among other things, this allowed them to take over France's colony of Indochina in Southeast Asia, what today is Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. In 1942, Japan pressured the Kingdom of Siam, now known as Thailand, into allying with Japan, Siam being one of the few truly independent countries left in Asia. All their alliance was partly with the knowledge that they didn't do it voluntarily, they would just be taken over. And aside from allowing Japan to move troops through Siam, Siam wasn't particularly involved in the war, although a few Siamese forces did help the Japanese invade British Burma next door. But all this, the Japanese said, was not about building an empire. They said it was about liberating Asians from colonial rule and creating not an empire, but a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, an Asia for Asians, although admittedly with the Japanese in charge.